luck to have young researchers with us in all of our activities, and Marwa is definitely one of them. And also to show that although the masters and the activities are being hosted by the two universities, but we're actually open to any cooperation from any kind. So Marwa is not stuck from Stuttgart, or Ancient is now cooperating with us in the case study, but just to show a good sign from our sides, from the IUSD, that we're really open to cooperation. So I'd like now to invite Marwa for the stage. Thank you.
Hello and good morning, and I would like to welcome you again, all of you here, being a new member to the IUSD program. Hard to welcome all of you, and thanks for your interest for the first session. My presentation today, Challenging Eternity in Vernacular Conservation, is part of my PhD dissertation or thesis. And I would like to focus in this presentation on a part of my PhD which is relative to an experiment relevant to urban living lab co-creation approach, which is applied in the western desert of Egypt. As I mentioned, my dissertation was mainly in the western desert area, 5 main desert oases. And I started to investigate the problem in those 5 main principal oases. And I chose Ghasla oasis as one, as a place to apply my case study application there. And I will try to show you a glimpse of this work and investigation.
Desert vernacular architecture is a kind of accumulation of inherited tradition that people inherit from one generation to another. People use the local available building materials to interact with their environment and climate to produce a kind of settlements that cope with their current needs. However, unfortunately, this type of settlements do not fulfill their needs anymore. So they started to leave their settlements to deteriorate intentionally or unintentionally and to live outside those desert settlements. So the situation actually now, it's either that they leave their settlements totally abandoned, deserted, so it's like almost like ghost cities and towns, or they built new houses within the old urban fabric of those settlements. Or unfortunately, some of them are totally swept away now by a concrete tide of, by a tide of a concrete loss of modern houses. And I'm not exaggerating if I say that what we see now here might not be there tomorrow. The situation there is really dramatic. What we perceive as those spectacular desert vernacular buildings, for the local inhabitants, it resembles a kind of old-fashioned way of living. Or it brings them the notion or the idea of this is kind of shame and poverty to live in such houses, or it's kind of peasant culture and a symbol of backwardness. They suffer from a lot of problems. The majority of them comes to relation to the lack of modern facilities, or some of the ants or termites that affect their buildings, which cause a lot of structural cracks, and of course that causes unsafe situations for themselves and especially for their children. We're not only losing the tangible part of these physical buildings, we're also losing the intangible aspect relevant to the craftsmanship, such as carpentry, blacksmithing, plastering, pottery making, and such other crafts that unfortunately the young generation are not willing to continue with these crafts anymore. So soon they will vanish or disappear. It's really paradoxical, and there's a big gap and a crack between what we perceive as authentic, traditional, resembles or identity or culture, and buildings that is really environmentally friendly and very economical to build, and what they perceive as a modern way of living, and they would like to use new techniques, live in modern houses, and of course they are seeking for better facilities, and this is globalization. They have satellite channels in their homes and they see how people live in big cities and they would like to be the same. From here, the problem mentioned now, comes my research question, which is why is the future existence of desert vernacular architecture is being threatened? And what specific risk is desert vernacular architecture currently facing in the western desert of Egypt? What is desert vernacular building traditional know-how, and how can it be documented and adapted to the needs of those living in desert vernacular dwellings? How can we conserve the future of desert vernacular architecture on a cooperative basis with local inhabitants? And finally, how can we think vernacular in a contemporary context and still preserve the environmental and cost benefits as well as the picturesque outward appeal of desert vernacular architecture? To be able to answer this question came the idea of designing and developing this conservation model, believing that if I manage to put my hands on vernacular morphology, I will be able to develop an understanding for current needs and future desires. Applying this in case study application, I will be able to develop a conservation model for thinking vernacular in a contemporary context. To be able to design this model, a methodology is needed. And case study methodology was chosen and adopted by this research. And it passes through mainly two phases, the explanatory phase and exploratory phase. The first phase applied two main methods, which is historical search and survey. Both the analysis and synthesis of those two methods lead us to the transdisciplinary participatory action research method. The three main methods will help in validating the conservation model for thinking vernacular in contemporary context. And here comes the application part of this methodology and applying this conservation model in the little town of Balad in the western desert of Egypt in an idea called this urban living lab experiment. This little town of Balat in the Western Desert used to be inhabited by 6,000 inhabitants. Unfortunately, now there are less than 150 persons only living there and only on the periphery of this little town. And you can see here from this satellite image the difference between the compact urban fabric of the old town and what you can see from this orthogonal structure of the newly built houses built from industrialized materials like concrete and fire bricks and so on. As I mentioned in the methodology, it started with this historical search. And in the archives, it was mentioned that this little town of Balat was started as early as the 17th century. And of course, the culture and tradition of this area was of high concern. Norms and traditions was also investigated and studied in this research. Things related to daily life activities like baking, olive oil juicing, mud brick casting, and even this normal plastering. The urban fabric was also the main concern that had been studied in this town. The typology and the geometry of the buildings, either residential or public buildings. The environmental and structural performance of the building, and it was also very important because you can see how people can cope with this harsh desert climate with a very flexible solution. Architecture and design was also very main concern to be documented and observed, and they used manual measurements together with laser scanning measurements because it was hard at a certain time to be able to measure such complex architecture. Statics was also investigated, this human touch and human proportion of those fantastic buildings. A lot of tools and techniques was used in the methodology. Sometimes I had to do things myself to be able to understand the building techniques and building materials. Questionnaires, interviews, video filming and photography was also an important tool to be able to understand this building know-how, especially to see, observe seniors while they are plastering or building their houses. And you can see here this laser scanning machine that I managed to use for some of the buildings. And here comes the third part of the methodology, which is the transdisciplinary participatory action research. And it was one of the most important phases, where both locals, local inhabitants, representatives from the local NGOs, the municipality, business owners, we collaborated together in order to put an idea of how we can conserve this traditional know-how that's about to disappear. So it came the idea of bringing a model for a house. We called it Neo-Desert Vernacular Model House, that combines between the authentic and traditional know-how, putting together what the local inhabitants suffer in their normal houses, and bring this into a further step to be able to improve and solve these problems in a contemporary model. So the participatory action research model started by identifying the problems together with the locals and community representatives, and then comes to the design of this research action step, formulating it, reflecting all the time and evaluating this action research phase, and then reflecting back on the problems and identify and observe new issues and so on. This participation passed by four main modes: contractual, consultative, collaborative, and collegiate. The first mode was the contractual mode, which means that the local inhabitants were contracted by verbal contracts to the project, and I was allowed to be a part of the investigation of the problem that they are suffering from. And then the consultative mode means that all local inhabitants were consulted for their problems and they gave their ideas about their future aspirations for new housing models. Seniors, youth, and even children were consulted for their ideas for the future. And then comes the collaborative mode, which means that together with the local inhabitants, we managed to design this house model to be able to combine between the traditional techniques and what they perceive for their future housing model. And then comes the last phase, which is the collegiate phase. Both worked together as colleagues, each one had different skills to offer, and we worked in a collaborative way to build and design this house model. After the design phase comes the construction phase. A lot of that list was done to be able to solve the current problems they are facing in the building techniques and building materials. And the building phase started from the construction of the foundation and mud brick casting, raising the walls, plastering, and so on. Both seniors, youth, and even women, they participated in this building application. And it was a really good chance for youth to be able to see these traditional techniques now, because the majority of them didn't have the chance to see how people used to build at all times. Ladies participate in this idea, or building the model, and it was one of the main tasks for them in all times to plaster or do this final rendering for the houses. And the construction phase continued until we managed to finish the carpentry work, tiles for floors and so on. Local inhabitants who participated in this building model, they were given incentives for their time and effort they spent in this project. And then it's finished in this form. And from here comes the contribution of this research work, which mainly deals with desert vernacular problems in an active, flexible, and practical manner, with the locals' contribution in all essential research steps. It also looks at the future as a means to conserve the existing desert vernacular values and its past heritage. And finally, the research is an attempt to document a living vernacular building tradition that is about to vanish and disappear. The research tried to look at conservation as it's not only a method of maintaining the identity of vernacular settlement, but rather as a mechanism in dealing with the changes within the social, economic, and cultural environment of vernacular settlements. And I would like to leave you with this message, that vernacular past still can be a catalyst for the future. For further interest with research work, it's available as a book format, and also it can be downloaded as an open access source from Lund University website. You will be able to see the videos, movies, photos and maps, laser scanning shots, and also the thesis PDF can be downloaded for free. I'm so grateful for your kind attention, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you so much.
For questions, we have 2 microphones. Just raise your hand and we'll pass one to you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite interesting to see that someone's interested in heritage and conservation issues. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned at the beginning that people are no longer interested in vernacular architecture. So when you built that building with the young ones, were they really interested in reviving their culture, or were they just interested because it was a project? And you said that you gauged whether they would like to live in such buildings anymore. So that's my question really. Are they still interested? Are they still interested in living in such buildings, or do they see it as something, retarded or distorted from the past?
Thank you for the question. Actually, yes, the young youth, those who are not willing anymore to live in those traditional houses, because for them they would like to live in concrete houses, the same style that people live in big cities. They appreciate the old houses because they understand quite well how it's very comfortable, especially in hot summer times. But for them, it's the idea of being modern, if that's what controls their way of thinking. So their participation in the project came from or the idea from the beginning to build this model didn't came, like I didn't impose the idea of building this house, imposing the idea on the society itself. It came from the investigations and discussing with them how can we improve the problems that they are facing. So basically the idea was how to improve the current issues like structural problems or cracks, and like how to integrate modern facilities into those integrate modern facilities into these old houses. So that was the idea that building this model came from this investigation of the problems. So they were not involved based on that, it's a project and they will get incentives to participate. But it came from their willingness to keep both the benefits of the old traditional houses and the modern facilities that they find in the concrete ones. So how to combine both, that was the idea of the project, and they started to give their notions how we can combine between those issues, and that was the final outcome of the project.
And towards the end, you had a feeling that they would be willing to live in these new buildings that combine both traditional and concrete?
I really hope for that, but it needs more research investigation to solve further problems, because I didn't manage to cover everything. I tackled things related to the structure, to the architecture, to the style, and embedding some more facilities, but I managed, of course, to cover everything. So it needs further research to be able to provide these traditional houses with all the equipment and facilities that they are seeking for.
Yes, thank you. I understand that one part of the problem seems to be that people not only don't want to live in old construction anymore. I think one part of the problem is also that their old image of this architecture is not so much accepted anymore. So my question is, did you start to work on a new image by using the old materials as well?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That was part of the local seminars that I did with the local inhabitants. I thought that maybe if I managed to introduce the idea of why people, for example, in Cairo or in Giza, it's big cities, and wealthy people, they decided intentionally to live in houses made out of mud brick, and it looks very modern and it's well furnished. So I did an interview with people living in Haraniya village here in Haram, Giza Governorate, and they, in a local seminar, I showed the local inhabitants those videos, and I asked the interviewees to talk about how their mud brick houses are very comfortable, especially in summertime, and how they decided intentionally to build with mud brick, however they can afford to build with concrete or any other modern material. So that in a way started to break the myth that mud brick houses is relevant, or it resembles a symbol of backwardness or peasant culture or an old-fashioned way of living. So that was successful in a way to try to change the idea or the perception of living in mud brick houses. Second, when they managed to see that they look modern from outside and also from inside they are well furnished, and for them, okay, that's what we need. We need our house to just look modern. And it's not only poor who live in these houses, only rich people live in such houses. Again, showing them pictures for the camps, like when they have these missions coming from different countries in the world doing this investigation and for archaeological research work, they live in mud brick camps, and it was built intentionally with this material, although they can afford to build with concrete. And again, it's the idea that even foreigners also, they prefer to live in mud brick houses, so it's not relevant to being poor or being peasant. And again, I showed them some pictures for ecologists in different parts of the world, in Spain and in the United States. So the idea changed completely when they managed to see other people living in mud brick houses, so that affected a lot their perception.
Thank you for the presentation. Is it right your research was focusing on Balad?
Yeah.
And as far as I know Balad, most of the houses are empty, partly animals are living inside. So with the experience from Siwa, with the rehabilitation of the Charlie area, we know that the most important part is the supply of water and electricity. Did you discuss it with the people in Balad as well, if they have the supply for the water, that they will move back to the historic area, or is it just as well, let's say, the property they don't want to go in, or the young people's not living inside?
Yeah, the old Balad now have electricity and telephone services, so that's not a problem at all for them. Concerning the water issue, only the houses on the periphery of the town, they have water supply. And the ones in the inner part of the town, they have like main taps in several places where they can provide them with water, but they don't have water directly inside their homes, because it was hard for the municipality to provide water for each single house inside due to the topography and due to issues relevant to being a listed town, and it was for them a kind of a risk if they can provide each house with water supply that can affect the fragile mud brick structure. So for the electricity, it's no problem. It's in some parts it's the issue of water, that they have to go to the nearest water source or a tap to provide their houses for house utilities with water.
Is that the problem of the wastewater?
They don't have wastewater because they have dry toilets and such things, so they don't have wastewater. You mean now for they use it in a very sensitive way, a delicate way, like they use exactly the amount of water they need, so they didn't have like plenty of water to be wasted, or to like think of how we can manage this wastewater in kitchens and such things. So they know how to use the water in a very intelligent way, because they know how the structure are very fragile to water. So they are very careful of that. The locals in Gaza, I mean. Is there any other questions? Reflections?
Well, I would like to ask you what the actual, let's say, contribution to a kind of modernization of this building type in your case took place, because you addressed this appeal that these buildings should capture people now, trying to break this prejudice that these buildings are not suitable for modern life. Now, you said that you tried to adapt this type of building to modern life. Could you please elaborate a bit more on what these steps were? I mean, at comparing this new building to the actual traditional ones, because these buildings obviously need to compete with this, these concrete boxes, and somehow there must be something to attract people to start living again in these buildings, which obviously have very big advantages as compared to these concrete boxes, especially during summer and so on. But what is the actual, I would say, the modern type of contribution that could make these buildings really attractive for lots of people?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Vernacular architecture mainly is trying to cope with the current challenges and the current changes in the environment, which means that locals along the years, they try to develop their houses to fulfill their current needs. At a certain limit, those houses wasn't able to fulfill the current needs because they were not able to equip the houses with modern toilets, modern kitchens, other facilities like electricity and natural gas, for example, and such things. So it was the idea to try to help them to think of some solutions, how to equip those houses with these facilities. It's not the idea of keeping it to look modern and shiny as concrete houses, because it has a certain a special identity that's totally different than concrete ones. Being able to compete, it should be left to the locals, that how they would like their houses to look like. It's not me as a researcher who's going to tell them how your houses should look like. So it's left to them. I was just a kind of facilitator, trying to help them, giving them technical assistance, how they can build these houses with what they like and what they are asking for. That's why they are leaving these houses to live in concrete ones. They still appreciate and understand how their traditional houses are very, how this house cope well with the harsh desert climate. It's just this gap that they are trying to fulfill or to merge, to be able to live in a suitable way, in a suitable modern way. So for me, it wasn't the idea of trying to develop actually the design as an architect to make it look modern, because for me it would be kind of as if I'm designing an ecology or a tourist resort. So it was actually for them. The decision was for them to choose and to decide how their houses should look like.
Thank you. Actually, for me, it seems to be just the conservation of nice vernacular heritage. But what about the economical part, development for the new basics to attract people to stay in their area and not to leave it for other economical reasons?
You mean the issue of gentrification, or
the economical part? You have to develop some economical basics for people to be attracted to their place. They leave it because they want to have new work facilities, and they have no services, no educational, health, and so on. These services are missing. I think they leave the place. They have nothing to do anymore in their small village, and this is the problem for most of the Egyptian villages, not only the villages in the desert.
Yeah, for me, in my case, it wasn't the issue of that they leave their old settlements because of an economical problems, because they still keep their old houses, and some of them they use it, they rent it out for other people, like people coming from different places, and they need an accommodation in these desert oases for a certain time. They keep it as a storage area, and some of them they just put their animals inside their old houses, and they just live on the outskirts of the old town. They don't live far away from it. And those towns, they are very close to schools and hospitals and other essential life needs that they need. So it wasn't a case that they are leaving their settlements for economical reasons. And the majority of them are farmers, so they still have their farmlands. So it's not relevant also to living in a concrete house or living in a mud brick house. It was just the facilities, or at least that's what I investigated during my research work, or the problems that I managed to touch upon. It was the issue of having these facilities. But it wasn't really relevant to economical issues, because it's the same type of job that they are still doing. And part of the question implies maybe beyond my limitation of my research work. Of course, it's really important. I understand how it is crucial and to be put into concentration, but I'm not sure that as an architect I should tackle all those issues, but I can understand how it's very important. Thank you. Now.
Thank you for showing us your interesting research experience. I'd like rather to come back again to your research methodology, which is the transdisciplinary participatory approach. How did you start your field work with the community there? Did you get any support from NGOs or from locals that you have already known before, or how did you get to convince the people to work with you and cooperate with you?
Okay, I approached the community at the beginning through the municipality, through trusted figures in the municipality. and then through one of the NGOs that work closely with locals. I just have one concern concerning your question using the word to convince. It wasn't the idea is to convince them, because it's you shouldn't convince people. You just try to approach them, show them your ideas, and the decision should be at the end for them.
But according to what you mentioned, that they were more convinced about the modern life, the concrete buildings, and not to come back again to their traditions.
Yeah, but it wasn't my role to convince them to go back. They are convinced with something, but it wasn't my role to convince them to go back to the old house, because you'll not be able to do that. You just show the benefits, and the decision should be their decision. Because you couldn't force people to come back to live in a place that they are not happy to go back again to live. It's the same as if I ask you now, you should go back to live in a farmhouse. And you say, no, I need to be in Cairo and travel abroad and finish my master's and my PhD or whatever. So it's hard to convince. It's just that you show the possibilities, and the decision should be their decision. Either to go back or to stay in the concrete houses.
We have the last question here from Defar.
For the presentation, I want to ask you, as you said that you don't want to convince them to come or to work with you, but you said that you want to. Okay. You said that you want to give them the freedom. You want to let them decide how their houses may show their houses, but don't you think that this way you may destroy the identity of the urban literature or the architecture of this village? Because people like the houses to look like modern or concrete houses, because these houses are the sign of maybe poverty in their mentality. So they want to maybe show modern signs on their houses.
But they still have the freedom to show these modern signs on the house. They are still building with concrete. So I'm not changing the identity of either the old or the new, because they are still building with concrete, and the old is still the building. So I'm just trying to fill in the gap between these traditional ones and the modern ones, which is totally different than the traditional houses. So it's still that they are building with concrete, and we're just trying to make a kind of compromise.
Thank you very much, Marwa, for this interesting presentation, and thanks also the audience for the questions. I've just took note of the issues. There was comments on how the infrastructure is being dealt with, the water. There was questions on economy. There was question on the image and the culture. Questions on how we deal with the community, where is the role of the architect and the planner starts and ends. Is he the master builder or he's a facilitator? And I think all of these questions are actually at the heart of our master. It's called integrated urbanism. So integrated urbanism is really focusing on understanding the whole image, trying to bring this all into one understandable concept, and then a decision should be then made in cooperation with local actors, with local society. We can definitely understand that within a research, a single piece of research, there are research limitations and boundaries of research, and I think this is why we have quite a wonderful bunch of good students. Everybody is interested, everyone is interested in one topic, and I think together that team really develops the culture of the integration among each other and among the whole group. I would like at the end of this session to thank Dr. Marwa again, and also to thank His Excellency Dr. Dabaieh Khalifa, the Minister of Water and Sanitation Services, Dr. Hussein Aissa, President of Ain Shams University, Dr. Jalal Al-Gima'i, First Secretary of the Ministry of Higher Education, Mrs. Anke Stahl from DAD, and Dr. Gunther Wehenpohl from GIZ. I'd like also to thank all the audience who honored us by coming to the opening session of this symposium, and I really wish you an interesting and enriching discussion during the 2 days. Thank you very much.